Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the military orders of PanOceania. Okay, so jokes aside, this is actually a faction focus that I've had a few requests to do, and one request in particular changed my mind about when and how I would handle that. Now, I didn't get the name of the person that made this request. They're a channel member, and YouTube concealed their name from me, which is totally fine, but they requested that some factions be looked at with an eye toward how they might change in N5. I've avoided doing the military orders faction focus and a couple of other faction focuses for that matter, just because I don't hugely vibe with them as a sectoral, and I don't like doing video content about stuff that I can't be at least a little bit upbeat about. I'm also, to be frank, not a very good military orders player. They're not my kind of faction, and that's not just because of their limitations, it's also their strengths don't gel with me too much as a player. However, given I've received some requests, and given that the idea of looking a bit more forward toward N5 is a really good time to have that kind of conversation, I reached out to a good friend of mine, Lockie, who goes by DeBorder on the forums and on Discord, and who has a YouTube channel that does small Infinity the Game battle reports, really in like a shorts format, very short and very digestible. I'll link that in the pinned comment below. And so as I have done in a few other videos where I'm not an expert in the faction, I've hit a person up, in this case Lockie, for content to talk about. So Lockie, thank you very much for the content. Thank you very much for the insight into how you play military orders. And so in this vein, we'll be talking about the military orders of PanOceania, how they play, what their strengths, weaknesses, and limitations are. And we'll be talking about their army profiles and the army in general with an eye toward N5 and how they might change, how we hope they might change, moving into the next edition. Now, Lockie's got his own perspectives on this. I've taken some of them on board, but the bulk of my thoughts on how the faction might change will be my own, so you can yell at me about that if you think I've got anything egregiously wrong. So, who are the military orders? Well, thematically, obviously, they are the holy knights of the church and the supporting military infrastructure. This isn't going to be a vibe that's for everyone, but for some people, it's a very cool and interesting aesthetic in particular to kind of lean into. Military knights in a modern military setting can work very well as a juxtaposition, and to be frank, who at any point has not posted, ironically or otherwise, a Deus Volta meme at some point before we all kind of realized that maybe they were a little bit less cool than we thought. But aged memes aside, it is worth really kind of celebrating that older concepts, older military concepts, knights and chivalry and the military orders juxtaposed with modern military or future military technology, which is what PanOceania Infinity is all about, is actually aesthetically a very cool space to explore and has produced some absolutely cracking miniatures. The military orders are not for everyone. You may actually genuinely want more alien vibes or more modern military translated into the future vibes, and Infinity offers those as well. But if that kind of thing, if the military orders models are something that you appreciate, well, there is some space to explore inside the sectoral. Mechanically, and this is Lockie's take, and I very much agree with it, he's much more experienced in military orders than I am. Mechanically, how they play is that they are a PanOceanian sectoral that forgoes a fair bit of the versatility you would normally expect at the lower end, so like sub 20-point profiles, and at the top end, so like tags, for example. They have those, but they're not versatile in terms of their selections, in exchange for correspondingly more versatility in the middle, so medium infantry and heavy infantry, including some maybe slightly too expensive, but also some cheaper heavy infantry. And that versatility of selection of heavy infantry means that you can list tailor, right, either to scenario or to a set of scenarios or to table or to opposing force with your heavier elements in a way that you otherwise might not in other PanOcean sectorals or other armies. Now, the price of this is that it is more difficult to get your meat and potatoes, your traditional infantry, all of your support, into a given build, and military orders list construction is often going to involve some pretty significant sacrifices. One of the things that Lockie notes is that it's very important to not try and chew off or take on too many challenges with an individual military orders list. You need to have a very clear goal in mind for each list, because the pieces that you're going to use to accomplish that goal are going to be expensive. They're going to be generally heavy infantry or more elite medium infantry or specialized elements like that. And so what this means is that you simply can't afford lots and lots of those pieces in any given list because they are all expensive. And so, if you try and cover lots and lots of ground with a military orders list, you're just going to spread yourself too thin. You simply won't have the points in a 300-point game to do all of the things that you might need separate individual heavy infantry profiles to accomplish. So, list building for military orders is very much an exercise in tailoring really clearly for, usually it's going to be scenario. This isn't something that Lockie has written down in his notes for me, but observationally, I have played against Lockie in the finals of multiple 3 and 5 round events with him using military orders. Now, that's sheer coincidence because he's played basically all of PanOceania. He and I just happen to have crossed swords a few times with him using his MO. But the list construction in each of those cases has been very, very like multiple iterations of tailoring to get those lists down to a point where he knows exactly what list he's playing in what scenario over the course of those 3 or 5 round events. Now, a second strength that Lockie notes is what he calls castle core or 5-person core flexibility. Like plenty of PanOceanian factions, the military orders are very capable of making a 5-person core. Unlike most PanOceanian factions, you are going to have to accept that this core is not going to get pure link bonuses, but once you come to terms with that, you actually can get some pretty versatile functionality out of these 5-person links. They are going to be more expensive than, say, a Fusilia core is, but they're also going to be more versatile. You can do things like fit actually kind of okay hackers and actual doctors, paramedics, and engineers. And so you can use this 5-person core to abrogate some of the expensive costs that you might incur if you otherwise took those as separate independent pieces. Now, in any other faction, this might mean you also get some really nice efficiency with your combat group slots, but hitting 15 troopers is something you're often going to struggle to do in military orders anyway, so that's not so much the case here. But you can make points savings by having your core link also be the place you put those kind of essential support elements, your doctors, your engineers, your hackers, in addition to maybe some ARO pieces. Now, as we get to weaknesses, the list of things to talk about with military orders unfortunately expands significantly. There are a bunch here. I'm going to kind of just read through the notes, but then I'm also going to talk about my own perspective as we shift toward how military orders might change in N5. So, weaknesses of military orders. To start with, lieutenant options. There are some interesting and compelling lieutenants in military orders, but they are all expensive. Even the cheapest lieutenants in military orders are still kind of expensive to the point of being overcosted, and the introduction of the Knight Commander didn't change this. Yes, a Knight Commander is cheaper than a piece like Deferson, but he's also a kind of a colossal deadweight and doesn't really meaningfully contribute well to a list, which means that you are pushed back toward having an active heavy infantry lieutenant, and there's relatively limited in the way of safety nets. Right, I think we have 1 chain of command and virtually no veterans. Yeah, exactly 1 veteran and 1 chain of command from memory in military orders. So you don't really have insurance against losing your heavy infantry lieutenant, which you are incentivized to take, because all of your actually good, useful lieutenant profiles are ones that really just are active HILTs. Now, if you get very good at using this kind of heavy infantry lieutenant, this can translate to a strength in certain limited circumstances. You can get good at using that kind of a piece and really gauging risk and knowing how to protect them, but that's a learning impost on the player. The army doesn't naturally translate it into a strength in the way that it would, for example, in Morats, where all of Morats basically are veterans, which means that if you wanted to, you can run an active lieutenant. If we sort of forget that Kornak exists in a 5-person core, right? If Morats had heavy infantry lieutenants as their optimal lieutenant profiles, they would support that very well. Military orders does have heavy infantry lieutenants as kind of their optimal lieutenant profiles, but doesn't support it very well, so you have to learn how to play into that risk. Another weakness of military orders, and this is one I very much agree with, is that despite being a Pan-Oceanian sectoral, they don't actually have very good long-range fire support. There are something like 5 heavy machine guns in the entire faction, and a lot of them are just not particularly good. Now, the Tick Belang of Montesa is a standout exception. It's one of the best gun platforms in the entire game, and we will absolutely be talking about it in the army section. but you really start hitting the bottom of the barrel far faster than you would for active fire support, like good quality active fire support, compared to any other Pan-Oceanian faction or sectoral. The ways that you can build your firepower pieces out in Neoterra and Svalaheimer are far more versatile and allow for more redundancy of things like armor cracking, for example, than you can get in military orders. And this makes military orders very susceptible to Pan-Oceanian lockout. If you're not familiar with that as a concept, it's basically that Pan-Oceania, more than any other faction, because they don't have, for example, smoke or much in the way of camouflage, can find themselves in a position where they lose one really important face-to-face roll, they lose their one big gun, and they no longer have any big guns or any way to advance up the table. And yes, of course, a good table will help you play around this, good list construction will help you play around this, risk mitigation will help you play around this. But if we just look at what is available to military orders in terms of a redundant firepower plan, you're often going to have one model in the list that can kill an enemy tag. And that's it. That's kind of it. And that's kind of a rough problem for a Pan-Oceanian army to have. And then the final thing that Lockie notes is that there really is a lack of diversity at the bottom end, or particularly there's a lack of efficiency as well at the bottom end of the faction. All of the cheaper stuff is it's a bit more expensive, it's a bit more limited than other sectorals. There are things like Raven Eye Officers, which are very good, but even those are 12 points, right? They're amazing deployment zone specialist mine layers, and they have materially helped the faction, but you will find that like 1 and 2 point premiums start adding up a lot over the course of multiple models, and especially the Cruziers, the new line infantry for military orders that were introduced this edition, are 11 points for no material advantage over a Fusilier, and on 3 of those, okay, yes, that's 3 points, it's 1% of your army, but you keep making those little sacrifices, those little inefficiencies, and then you try and support a list that is trying to run multiple heavy infantry, and it's challenging. It's challenging from a list construction perspective, which leads us back to that problem of needing to really clearly specialize towards your win condition to be successful with military orders. Now, this brings us to the question of, okay, look, they're a faction that struggles a little bit. You can absolutely win with them, right? I mentioned I've played against Lockie in multiple finals of events, which it would not be possible for him to get to without a winning record up until that point. But they are a faction that struggles. How might that change as we move toward N5? How might they be improved? How might they be brought up to spec? And to answer that, I'm going to talk first about what I don't think the answer is, and then what I do think the answer is, and then a touch of optimism. And then we'll get into the army review. So, what I don't think the answer is any kind of silver bullet thinking. This is something that I've seen come up in a few conversations, because this is something I have been talking to just casually with people recently. And I don't think there is one solution. So something that I saw proposed, I know this was just off the cuff and borderline facetious, but I saw one person who I know is very smart and very clued about this game say, oh, if you just made Teutonic Knights AVA total, you would fix military orders. Now, they know that's not actually the case, because that's not a fix, right? That does not fix military orders. It gives them one strong competitive skew archetype, which does not make the faction well-rounded, interesting, explorable, and compelling. And that's because all of the other problems would still exist, and those other problems really are that, look, military orders as a faction doesn't have a single, like, oh, it's terrible because of X. It struggles under the weight of multiple small inadequacies. There are lots of small inefficiencies. There are lots of small struggles. There are lots of things that just like aren't quite good enough to be really compelling. There is no really good standout, like, yeah, if you leverage this strength, it will make up for the other elements in a way that's interesting or compelling. The good news is that this actually makes military orders potentially very fixable on a broader scale by being the recipient of just a relatively large number of smaller upward tweaks. And the reason why I've been thinking about that is to go back and look at one of the N5 profiles that has been revealed already, which is the JSA Shikami. Now, if we look at the Shikami, in N4, it's a model that, like, the model is fantastic, and the concept is very, very cool. Heavily armored ninja, hypermobile, mimetism -6, bounces off the walls, runs in, stabs you while being a HI. It's a really cool concept. It really resonates in terms of the fantasy that it presents. but it never really quite worked because it was very, very expensive. And it was only any good in close combat. Like, there are Shikami profiles at long range that have something like a contender as their gun. It's just, you cannot always get into CC, particularly without a marker state or smoke, and the Shikami was just not cutting it if you had to use it at longer range. Okay, fast forward to N5, we have seen an N5 Shikami profile. How has it changed? Well, I think it's had a small downward points tweak, although I would have to check that. Obviously, martial arts and stuff have changed, but it's been given ballistic skill 12 up to 13, and it's been given a multi-rifle, basically with no really material cost change. And while a ballistic skill 13 multi-rifle is not necessarily anything to write home about, it is a viable weapon. It is a viable ranged weapon if you need to use that. And the Shikami is now in a position, as it moves into N5, where it can use those hypermobility skills and outstanding mimetism in now multiple different ways. It can be that heavy infantry ninja that can both take short-ish ranged gunfights and get into close combat at a price point that is, look, still a bit expensive, but much more reasonable now for the package that you get. So, look, I'm not saying, well, the secret to improving military orders is to give everything +1 ballistic skill like the Shikami, but, right, small improvements that help pieces fulfill kind of like the role that we want them to be able to fulfill without actually explicitly just numerically buffing them so that they're more powerful than anything else, right? Those small buffs spread across much of military orders to push a number of their profiles into a more efficient space potentially turns the faction into a really solid one in N5. And so in that vein, as we head now into the army review section, as we go through and we showcase a number of profiles in military orders, from time to time I will talk about things that I think could change. Maybe this will be a fair bit of wish listing, if I'm being perfectly honest, but profiles that can be called out as being worth improvement or attention by the developers as we move into N5, even in small ways that cumulatively could add up to a really good military orders as we move into 5th edition. So, we're going to start as we usually do by kind of working through light links, heavy links, and then things that can be added to links, wildcards, before moving on into independent elements that then supplement the force. Now, a lot of the strength and the good things we're going to be talking about are in that latter section, so it'll be the former ones that we cover, really like what we might like to see improve as we move forward. Now, the distinction between light and heavy links is a lot less clear in military orders because the cruisers form the basis of a military orders fire team that can actually have a lot of heavy elements in if you want, but it's the light fire team if that's what you're looking for, and they are the basis. And kind of as is the case in plenty of other sectorals, they really are just the beginning of the link that you add specialist models to in order to fill it out. It's not the cruisers that are going to be doing the significant work. You can theoretically have a 5-person Crozier link that is just really pretending to be a Fusilier link, where you have, 4 Croziers with combi rifles, one of which is a paramedic and one of which is a multi-sniper, but that's 5 points more than a commensurate Fusilier link for no discernible reason. I'm actually not sure why Croziers cost 11 points. Like, yes, they have more close combat than a Fusilier, but not meaningfully more close combat. Like, 15 is not a stat that should have accrued a points cost in how N4 does its points for close combat, and religious troop is usually considered to be a disadvantage, which should decrease the cost of the model. So I don't actually know why Croziers cost 11 points when I feel like potentially they should cost 10 as the basis. But the other reason why you probably wouldn't use this as a link particularly often, in addition to the minor points inefficiency, is that usually that kind of a link would be where you would home things like other useful specialists. Maybe you might put a Fusilier hacker in there, just if that was something you needed to have in a list. And it's often where you'll home a lieutenant and a lieutenant decoy, which, yes, you can theoretically do by taking a knight commander who is very, very expensive compared to a co-adjudicator cruiser. But the Knight Commander is not really a particularly usable profile and really blows the cost of them out. So instead, what we really see Croziers used for is the basis of an impure, right, no composition bonuses core link, that then we can add quite a lot to. Now, when we get to the link supplement pieces, we'll talk about, okay, what we add to a Crozier link that really spices it up. Those are going to be things like Blackfriars, and Knight Commanders. Well, sorry, not Knight Commanders. So Blackfriars and Knights of Justice, misspoke. We can add Knight Commanders, but I'm not going to be particularly high on them. But particularly things like that, or even Curators, which are the engineers, to give ourselves a well-rounded support light infantry link. You can also add Teutonic Knights, up to 3 Teutonic Knights, which I think is the total availability of Teutonic Knights, into this military orders fire team, which makes it into a heavy infantry fire team, basically. The Teutonic Knights are just a different composition of this. And that does actually enable some pretty interesting mixing and matching, particularly when we get to Order Sergeants, which are another kind of light infantry we're talking about next that can be added to these kind of links. Now, in terms of future improvements, really apart from probably just dropping every profile by 1 point to accommodate the fact that Religious Troop is nominally a disadvantage, and these guys are otherwise not meaningfully different from Fusiliers, I don't think Croziers are necessarily a piece that needs too much in the way of changing, mostly because Order Sergeants are what I would expect to pick up some of that slack when we get into the sort of like the thematic role of different pieces in military orders. Order Sergeants, for me, fill the role of more specialist support pieces, and so it's Order Sergeants that we can give the sort of slightly more specialized roles to, whereas the Croziers really are just left as the line infantry, and they should just function as line infantry. And they mostly do, like they have a multi-sniper profile, they have combi rifle profiles, they have a paramedic profile. That's enough if they're just not inefficient. Now, as we jump into Order Sergeants, that's where we see the potential, what they already have, right? They are specialized troopers, and we have the potential for further specialization. Now, just as a note on theme, Order Sergeants in the fluff of military orders are actually uninitiated, i.e. non-religious specialists. They are people who serve the military orders in the same way that they would serve any other branch of the PanOceanian military. It's a bit weird for that reason that they have religious troop, but fair enough, I guess they're still believers. And on a personal note, thematically, I would be kind of interested to see Order Sergeants rethemed or potentially expanded into more of a squire kind of role. That's something that is uniquely missing from the fluff and theme of the military orders, is that there isn't anything that really stands out as a squire to the knights, right? So a lightly armored, a light or medium infantry element that exists really specifically to work with and form links with and support the knights. The closest we have to that is Order Sergeants, and thematically they are absolutely not squires, right? They are regular personnel. But for me, mentally at least, they fulfill that kind of role until we actually get a squire piece. Now, what are Order Sergeants and what do they do? In contrast to Croziers, Order Sergeants are kind of even less efficient profiles when you look at the baseline combi rifle piece. 13 points for a ballistic skill 12 combi rifle compared to 11 on the part of the Croziers. But the Order Sergeants make up for that with really interesting profiles basically from there on out. Because when you look at what is causing that 13-point combi rifle Order Sergeant profile, it's an extra point of willpower and 3 points of BTS and some meaningless close combat, which you can either very effectively salvage with cool equipment loadouts or utilize by basically making them a hacker. And we see both of those here. And it's for that reason that Order Sergeants are some of my favorite profiles in military orders, and more generally are my favorite profiles that I never take because I can't afford the damn things because everything in military orders is too expensive. But basically everything here, apart from the generic combi Order Sergeant, has some utility at some point. The HRL Order Sergeant without an Oxbot is 15 points for a long-range gun that can be slotted into a full core, admittedly without any kind of core bonuses. The Hacker is a reasonable willpower, reasonable BTS hacker for a relatively reasonable cost. 18 points, you could do far worse than that. And then we start getting into all of the Oxbot profiles, which are all of the same things, except also with Oxbots. And Oxbots are one of the coolest models in the game. They are PanOceanian warbands. They are very, very, very useful. And although I'm sure there's something that would prove me wrong, I think it's quite possible that there isn't a single bad profile with an Oxbot in the game. Like, at worst, they are potentially a little sub-optimized, and it's not the Oxbot that is the problem there. So, for that reason, there's a lot in the Order Sergeants that you can like and that you can use. It's just, as always, you must specialize a military orders list, and some of these Order Sergeant pieces don't necessarily fit into a specialized plan. Like, the Hacker Oxbot Order Sergeant is a really, really cool concept, that just you can't always fit into a list because it's 22 points, and 22 points is a non-trivial amount. And so I would actually say that I don't think Order Sergeants need too much in the way of changing as we move to N5. Rather that, if military orders open up a little bit and become a little bit more flexible, and they need less hyper-specialization to succeed, Order Sergeants might find a little bit of space appearing in the canopy into which they can rise. Now, if I was to suggest changes, it would be to add profiles to the Order Sergeants that help them integrate more with the military orders and knights that they are supporting. And so one of the ways that you might do that is to have something like Order Sergeants Hospitaller or Order Sergeants Teuton, which count as Hospitaller Knights or Teutonic Knights when they join a link comprised of those pieces, and do something that supports those pieces well. So Order Sergeants, for example, I would say would be a great profile to add a cheap Tinbot to. Like, yes, we can get Tinbots in military orders links, but not necessarily easily. The Teutonic Knights have it. The Hospitaller Knights, I want to say, don't, unless you do something like add in a Santiago, blah, blah, blah. But a Tinbot -3 on a linkable Order Sergeant that is also doing something else, right? Little specialized profiles that can add to the larger heavy infantry links without breaking composition bonuses could be really, really good. It also fits kind of into that Squire vibe that I personally wouldn't mind seeing in military orders, although, of course, as noted, Order Sergeants are not Squires. They are just professional military personnel that happen to work for the military orders. Now, from here, we're actually going to jump straight into heavy infantry links by starting with Teutonic Knights, which really bridge the gap by being able to join those light infantry and mixed links. But we will circle back around to all of the things you can add to a link to supplement it and talk a little bit about some of those. But here we get to really one of the first just genuinely great profiles in military orders, and one which you can find your way to including into almost any list, and that's the Teutonic Knights. Now, some people will be old enough to remember the Magister Knights that Teutonic Knights effectively displaced, and we all miss the Magister Knights very badly, those of us that remember them, but Teutonic Knights are very sound profiles. They're 6-2 movement, they are exceptionally good at dodging, and they dodge further than their second move value, which can open up further mobility options. They are good enough in close combat to beat basically any non-experts with that CC22 Martial Arts 2. And the baseline profile has a light shotgun and a Panzerfaust, which keeps it a clean and cheap 19 points. Now, 19 points isn't cheap in the grand scheme of things, right? You can't have an entire army comprised of 19-point models particularly easily, but for what you get, 19 points is value, as is 20 points by adding in a Tinbot. And expanding out from there, we see other useful profiles. We see a specialist with a submachine gun, ballistic skill 13. I'd rather a light shotgun, but a submachine gun is fine, and being a specialist is good. The only specialist to shoot on. There's both a Spitfire and an NCO Spitfire role, which are only ballistic skill 13, but they are still heavy infantry with good fizz that can have a paramedic backing them up quite comfortably. And we see, so the NCO is one of only 2 NCOs in the entire faction, which does add a little bit of order efficiency, particularly if we are taking, say, a Knight Commander. But the Teutonic Knight Lieutenant, light shotgun, Panzerfaust, 19 points, is probably the best cheap lieutenant option in the entire sectoral. The biggest problem with the Teutonic Knight Lieutenant is that it's sometimes going to be a little obvious that it's your LT. And that's purely off the back of the availability profiles. Like, Teutonic Knights are only AVA3. 3 Teutons is very good. Including 3 Teutons is fine. I don't necessarily think they need to be a higher availability. There are other things I would like to see changed about military orders significantly more than that. But it can be just a touch obvious when you are taking a Teutonic link, and say you're taking a submachine gun specialist and a light shotgun Panzerfaust and a Spitfire. Only one of those models could be the LT, and your lieutenant may have been given away by just sort of what else is going on in the list. You know, yes, technically a Knight Commander is also Willpower 13, but if you're taking a Knight Commander with a regular number of orders, then you have just overpaid for nothing effectively, and your opponent is already going to be up, so they're often going to just assume that the Teutonic Knight in this instance is a likely Lieutenant profile and attempt to target them for elimination. That's a very small downside to what's otherwise a very good Lieutenant profile if you want an active, relatively durable Lieutenant. But it is still kind of a compromise to take the Teutonic Lieutenant profile, because there are Lieutenant profiles that spend Lieutenant order really profitably, and we'll get to a couple of those as we move on into the Hospitalia Super Friends group. But the Lieutenant Teuton has a light shotgun, and you don't really want to be using your Lieutenant for close assault, high lethality, very dangerous, likely to get you killed, boarding action style movements. Now, there isn't any other profile in the Teutonic Knights that I would sort of like, oh, let's just make that the lieutenant instead. Like, certainly not the missile launcher, for example. All of these pieces have to be active. It's the nature of the beast. If you want a cheaper lieutenant, then the Teutonic Knights kind of are where you have to go. But solving the problem of lieutenants is really a broader matter for military orders and potential future upgrades to the sectoral that I don't think is an indictment of the Teuton LT. Look, overall, Teutonic Knights are one of the few profiles in military orders that I don't really think needs any change at all. If anything, the only changes that I would sort of be interested in seeing to Teutonic Knights is to do something like add, say, order sergeants that count as Teutonic Knights, or justice knights that count as Teutonic Knights, to allow them to actually reach full 5-person composition bonuses, because at present that's impossible. And those changes alone, I think, would be enough to add another archetype to the way that you can play Teutonic Knights, because they certainly don't need to be moved around much themselves. They're very good. Now, from here, we move on to the Holy Order of Hospitaller Knights of St. John of Scoverodino? Anyway, the Knights of the Hospital of St. John. And here I think is where we hit the first, we were on the cusp of greatness, major disappointment in military orders. Because Hospitaller Knights are really, really close to being good without actually being good. Now, they are a 5-person core. You can take them AVA 5, and unlike Teutonic Knights, there are multiple characters that actually count as Knights Hospitaller that can join that 5-person core, keep that full composition bonus, and make really a pretty solid-ish Death Star kind of unit that falls just short of actually really being good in that role, because the ultimate cost is just a little bit too high. Now, in terms of things that I can call out that are absolutely good, you've got boarding shotgun and multi-rifle profiles that are very close to being competitively priced, particularly given their ballistic skill 14, armor 4, BTS 6, 2 wounds. You have a genuine whip 13 doctor in a whole link team full of cubes, which is very, very solid, and there's some versatility in how that doctor is laid out. You have an interesting forward deployment profile with a boarding shotgun, and you even have a heavy machine gun. But it's the heavy machine gun where the problems begin, because it's just a heavy machine gun. And damage 15, even damage 15 with burst 5, ballistic skill 17, starts to really throw away entire turns if you have to do something like dislodge an enemy heavy tag. And none of the pieces that you can add to a Hospital Knight order really materially help with that. The closest that you get on screen now is Kyle Hawkins, who does add multi-ammunition to a marksman rifle, which means that he's going to be ballistic skill 17 burst 4 with armor-piercing rounds, albeit damage 13 armor-piercing rounds. That is better than trying to engage with a heavy machine gun. It's not a ton better, but it is better, but it's not the kind of firepower dominance that you want as a PanOceanian player. Now, in terms of changes to the Knights of the Hospital themselves, before we get into talking about Joan and Deferson, who I don't think particularly need improvements, the Knights of the Hospital are a unit regiment that I would like to see changed a little, but not made cheaper. I wouldn't mind it if, as mentioned, you had some order sergeants of the hospital that could join a Knights Hospitaller regiment, even just like one order sergeant that could join that link team and bring its points down a little bit, right? Like maybe a Tinbot hacker order sergeant that could go in as a much, 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 much cheaper alternative to the Knight of Santiago, for example. Right, but a single lighter piece that you could add to that link team to help bring its points cost down and add something useful. What I would actually like to see Hospitaller Knights tweaked for is two things. Firstly, I don't think they need a ballistic skill improvement. I don't think they need an armor or BTS improvement. I don't really think they need an improvement to their close combat. And I think staying at move 4/4 is fine, because part of the vibe of Crusading Knights is heavily armored troops, right? Like the medieval, the romantic idea of the knight is a person clad head to toe in full plate mail, at least in terms of the romantic ideal. I know in practice, yes, that's not necessarily always true, and that what a knight was changed over the course of history in terms of how they were armored, how they fought, etc. But it's the Hospitaller Knight profiles that can really help lean into that knight in heavy armor kind of vibe, and I think they would warrant just a couple of small tweaks to help them fit that role better. And so, in that vein, what I would not mind seeing on them at all is something like ballistic skill attack +1 damage, just basically on all of them, right? Let's get the multi-rifle up to damage 14, the multi-marksman up to damage 14, the heavy machine gun up to damage 16. None of those are world beaters, but all of them then at that point begin to flip over into powerful enough to engage enemy heavy targets if you need to. And if you're taking a link of Hospitalers, they're your big guns. You need to be able to take those fights. Now, that alone, plus, say, the introduction of a Hospitaller Order Sergeant, might comfortably be enough, but something else that could be considered is not increasing their armor, but giving them something like immunity to armor piercing. We know that that doesn't break the game. It's not a colossal upgrade, right? It already exists in Morats, and no one is sitting here complaining about how resilient Suriats are. They're just armor 4 heavy infantry like anything else. But I do think that that's something that you could add to Hospitaller Knights to give them some situational additional resiliency that does just help them lean into the fact that they are slower than many other heavily armored close combat troops, right? They're slower than JSA troops, they're slower than Teutonic Knights. They could stand to be more than just 1 point of armor, more resilient in a kind of situational way. Those are both changes I think I would kind of like to see to the Knights of the Hospital, in addition to the introduction of one Hospitaller Order Sergeant that I think would put them in a really solid place as that kind of heavy infantry, trample up the board, be tough, be durable, don't necessarily move particularly fast, don't necessarily have tons of order efficiency, right? Like, I don't want to see tactical awareness and an NCO added to the Knights of the Hospital. I don't want them to be able to bomb across the table. I want them to be able to move forward over multiple turns, taking space progressively and being durable and dangerous as they make that advance, as they lay down fire before eventually launching a close assault or taking some ground or dislodging a position. I think that's the idealized fantasy for the Knights of the Hospital, whereas it is other pieces like the Montesa Knights and the Teutonic Knights that launch those more aggressive, really, really rapid offenses. Now, in terms of other pieces that can join a hospital link that I don't think really need any significant changing, we're going to start with Father Officer Gabriel de Fersen, who, despite counting as a Knight of the Hospital, is not a Hospitaller at all. Are you, Gabriel? You come from a different order, one that has been disbanded for doing terrible things, which is a really cool backstory. Now, Gabriel de Fersen is one of those pieces, one of those rare pieces that you can describe as a Haris team in a can, because he does, if you wanted to run him unlinked, he would still be fully capable in that role. He is a Whip 14 specialist, he is a hacker that has a great suite of hacking profiles thanks to having the hacking device plus upgrade Trinity, and good BTS and good willpower, and he has a Spitfire, and it's a ballistic skill 14 Spitfire, which if he's in a link means that he's got a ballistic skill 17 burst 5 gun if he's in a full 5-person core. Now, if there is a downside to Gabriel de Fersen, it's that, look, he's pretty much worth, even without the frenzy bonus, right? The frenzy points discount, he's pretty close to worth 51 points. Like, the full package is hard to argue with, but it's also really hard to find 51 points in military orders on a dime. Now, in this case, I think that's as it should be. I do not think Gabriel de Fersen needs buffs. If there are, right, those improvements that I mentioned introduced to the Knights of the Hospital, you might actually see Gabriel get a very small upward points tweak to accommodate them, because a ballistic skill 15, sorry, a damage 15 Spitfire, right, and immunity AP on a model that is doing the things that he's doing, that starts to actually become kind of no joke. But even if he stayed exactly as he is, if the rest of the list could accommodate a 51-point model more easily, he'd be an absolute banger. In fact, he's pretty close to an absolute banger as he is already, because that suite of capability is just really, really solid. For my money, I would say he is probably the best lieutenant in the sectoral, because he can spend a lieutenant order more safely and profitably than, say, a Teutonic Knight. He's less expensive than some of the other options, I think, but he actually does something, right? Including de Fersen is something I'm happy to do on his own merits, which means that, okay, cool, well, he might just spend the lieutenant order at some point, no problem. If he dies, I'm in for a rough time, but if I was going to lose him, I was in for a rough time anyway. But unlike a Teutonic Knight, I'm not obliged to expend him offensively by making shotgun assaults, right? Gabriel can really have be utilized in a much more conservative and careful way that doesn't get him killed. And unlike Joan, he isn't a build around. And speaking of Joan, the build around. Actually, less expensive than Gabrielle Deferson, at least in her multi-rifle heavy armor variant, but if we switch over to the mobility version, we can see she comes very, very close to his points cost at 50 points compared to 51. Now, Joan is a piece that is in tension in military orders because, on one hand, there are some irregulars that you can add and really help abrogate her points cost. You can take a War Core, you can take a Tech B. That's suddenly 8 points for 2 orders, which makes her 50, 45 point price tag much more accommodatable. The tension is that frankly, the best part of inspiring leadership, unless you are absolutely spamming irregulars, is actually the free coordinated order. And if you're taking Joan and you want to use that coordinated order, you need to not link her. Now, in vanilla PanOceania, that's no problem. You weren't going to link her anyway. She's going to use that free coordinated order to her heart's content. She's going to transition into an offensive attack piece herself in the late game when that sort of frenzy no longer matters as much and her loss is not as dangerous. And you have many, many irregulars to make regular. In military orders, you have far fewer irregulars to make regular, although you do still have some. And you cannot afford to just randomly take a 50-point piece that doesn't do anything in military orders. She has to be more active over the course of the game. And if you link her, then it's going to be very, very difficult to be using her special coordinated order because you can't do that while you're linked. So there's a lot of tension around Joan, which makes her, frankly, a much better vanilla PanOceanian lieutenant than a military orders one. And to be honest, I don't think there's much you can do to change that, and it's kind of fine. If she's a military orders, sorry, if she's a vanilla lieutenant as the best way to run her, then she's a vanilla lieutenant as the best way to run her. The fact that she doesn't fit super well into military orders is something I think you can adjust by changing or adding a military orders profile for her. Change the way that she fights in military orders, give her some kind of classy optimized profile that is only available to military orders, which banks less on the coordinated order and making irregulars regular and makes her more into like an actual fight piece. What this might be, I have no idea, but just a military order's unique profile that is just a little bit more tweaked or a little bit better suited for fighting alongside a core link of Knights of the Hospital, for example, is how I would be inclined to run Joan. You could even do something like having a little rule that says, like right there in that thing where it says there can only be one Joan of Arc in each army list, add a little extra line of text that says, Crusade fire teams joined by Joan of Arc always benefit from full composition bonuses. And cool, there you go. There you have a reason for having her. She does a unique thing in military orders, which she allows all of the military orders to fight effectively together. You have Knights of Santiago and Knights Hospitaller and Knights of the Hospital, sorry, and Teutonic Knights fighting in the same link team, just for example, with full composition bonuses. Would that be broken? Probably not, but you'd need to actually check and test. I'm riffing here, right? This is not a serious, like, this is definitely what Corvus Belli should do, but it is an idea about how she might be made a bit more unique in military orders. Now, from here we jump, staying in the link teams part of the review, we jump into the supplementary elements, the things that can join link teams to spice them up or round them out, and we start with the Sacred Military Order of the Knights of Santiago. Thematically, these are some of my favorite pieces in PanOceania. The fact that these are like boarding action Navy specialist knights is really cool in how it plays on that juxtaposition of the old medieval vibes and Infinity's like future warfare. Having military orders pieces that specifically are like drop troops and space combat is really cool. Like that's really, really cool as a concept, and I really like them. And the profiles are mostly pretty good as well. Now, the big problem is that they have 360 visors, which are hugely expensive, and for the love of God, make that piece of equipment cost less in N5 Corvus Belli, please. But that is basically the only complaint I have about the Knights of Santiago, because otherwise, there's a ton going on. Like, they are expensive, right? They are expensive pieces. These are big points costs, like 43, 39, 45, 43. We are not getting cheap capability here, but the actual profiles do really cool things. Now, we've got 3 models that can join Link and 1 drop troop. The models that can join Links have profiles like a killer hacker Tinbot. That's awesome. Oh, and by the way, good close combat decharges. Excellent. We've got a Spitfire Specialist Operative with EM grenades and decharges. That model can do a ton of things, particularly given that it's an elite troop and heavy infantry. We have a Lieutenant profile of the same version. Now, utilizing that Lieutenant is not easy, but it's doing at a cheaper price than Deferson some of the Deferson things, where it might actually productively spend its own Lieutenant order, because that's still a Ballistic Skill 14 Spitfire, and in this case it's a Specialist Operative rather than a Hacker, but it's much, much cheaper than Deferson. And so these are all basically like useful profiles that are doing interesting and spicy things. They're just very slightly overcosted because a 360 visor is one of the most expensive pieces in Infinity for reasons I have never been able to fully discern. Now, special note, completely outside the context of Link teams, goes to the Combat Jump Hacker Killer Hacker profile, which is the most expensive of the entire set of Knights of Santiago, but is one of the most like make or break pieces in the game. Now, the big downside of this piece is that it is landing on 13s. If you take an Evo hacker, you telegraph its presence really, really hard. And even an Evo hacker only gets it to landing on 16s outside of specific missions, which still gives you a 20% chance to throw 45 points of your army down the frickin' drain by failing that roll, which for some people, quite reasonably, is just not a risk that they're willing to take particularly often. But if you do take this piece, and you do either just jank that Fizz 13 roll, and you have to make that roll because it does not have Parachutist, it just has Combat Jump, it is landing from orbit whether you like it or not, it is a hell of a piece. It is dangerous in close combat, it has a boarding shotgun and it's going to land in an ideal point for close assault. It has shock mines for doing like forks with the mines and the boarding shotgun and the close combat, and it's a killer hacker. Now, it's not the best killer hacker in the game. It's Whip 13, BTS 3, but it has 2 wounds and it's a killer hacker. And a killer hacker that jumps your hacker from outside, like it just gets inside your repeater network and attacks you directly inside zone of control, in its turn is going to mess most hackers up. Even an interventor that doesn't have a firewall to hide behind does not want to take that fight. And sure as sure, in one of the 2 games I have played against Lockie, he landed I think he just hard landed, or maybe it was on 16s, a Knight of Santiago boarding shotgun, and it almost saved the game for him just by itself. It made a hell of a run through my DZ, it was barely stopped, and it is a fearsome piece. Now, in terms of changes to the Knights of Santiago, apart from please reduce the points cost of 360 visors on every model that has 360 visors. I don't mind if it's a scaling amount, right? Like, let's keep the Sierra drone bot and Turtle Reaction bots close to how much they currently cost, and let's significantly discount the Magariba. You cowards, why does she cost that much? A Santiago Knight probably doesn't go down by as much as, say, a Magariba does, but it probably should come down in points. The other change that it would be interesting to see in N5 is we know that Corvus Belli would like there to be more ways to spend command tokens, and having a way to spend command tokens to interact with combat jump rolls is actually something I'd really like to see. I don't know what form that would take. I've actually discussed this a little bit with Lockie. Do you just spend a command token to get a +3 to land? Do you spend a command token to land automatically provided it's in your half of the table or not inside the enemy deployment zone roll? There are a number of ways that you could structure that rule, but the basic idea of can I please spend a command token to give my 45-point drop trooper a marginally better chance of actually making the drop that his entire value is contingent on, would go a really long way to enabling that 45-point drop trooper to actually recoup some of the value that you spend and potentially crack games open. Overall, though, Santiago Knights, apart from please fix 360 visors, are not a profile suite that needs a lot of changes. There's a ton of potential there. Now, next up, we get to the Knights of Justice of Military Order, and here I think we start to see where the seams are creaking a little bit in terms of the design. Now, the good news is that means there's a lot of potential for tweaks. Knights of Justice are basically all of the things that you might associate with the heaviest knights in the military orders, except that they have no frenzy bonus to offset the cost of their close combat, which means they are as expensive as balls. Now, I do not necessarily think that we should give them frenzy and just cut their points cost down a whole lot, but there is definitely some work to be done for these profiles. Now, there are cool things about these profiles. The fact that you can have a missile launcher Knight of Justice that can just slap into a 4-person link team and be an Armor 5 heavy infantry missile launcher in a link with 6th Sense, like, that's pretty cool. You'd absolutely pay for it, and in many lists you just won't be able to afford that, but that's pretty cool. The Spitfire is a little bit mid. It's a 47-point Spitfire. We could probably do better than that. But we get some interesting things happening with stuff like the Hacker hacking device, which is a BTS-9 hacker. Like, that's infuriating, particularly when you add the second wound into it. But that's kind of where the things I have to say about the Knight of Justice, sort of the good things, kind of run out, because the points cost ultimately are very large. I also think the Knights of Justice kind of fail at the fantasy that they're trying to sell. Now, I have not looked up their fluff, but my understanding is that the Knights of Justice, as sort of like followers on, at least the Father Knights used to be actually the priests within the military orders. The Knights of Justice have been renamed because you can't call them, well, actually, you could have called them Father Knights and released a female sculpt. That's just a power move. Why did they not do that? Just keep them called Father Knights, release the female sculpt with Ice Storm, refuse to elaborate, and leave. Like, let us figure out what that means. But regardless, at least in terms of how the model's theme is communicated mechanically, i.e., what their mechanics sell to me, is the idea that these are the elite, steady, not necessarily leaders, but these are the heavy veteran exemplar kind of pieces of the military orders. And I feel like their profiles should probably kind of be built accordingly. And I don't necessarily mean give them a heavy machine gun, because it's the Hospitaller Knight that has the heavy machine gun, right? Like, the weapon loadouts are kind of fine. I would absolutely say give anything that has a combi rifle here, just make that a multi-rifle, right? Give it the Shikami treatment, stop it, do not put combi rifles on 46-point models. But apart from that, I would like to see a change here where these are the Knights of Justice of the military orders, which means that they should be able to count as members of the military orders when they join those link teams. Knights of Justice included in a Hospitaller military order link team should count as Knights of the Hospital, because this is nominally a Knight of Justice of the military order of the Hospital of St. John. Knights of Justice that join a Teutonic Knight link should count as Teutonic Knights, because they are, in that case, they are Knights of Justice of the military order of the Teutonic Knights. Now, that change alone opens up some additional usability for them, but I think there's also, frankly, a fair bit of space to buff these profiles as well. And how I would kind of like to see them buffed is to incorporate some of the elements in particular of the Knights of the Hospital and the Teutonic Knights. And we can do that with, right, like if we look at the Hospital Knight, so if we look at the Teutonic Knight profile, what do we have that's missing from the Knights of Justice? We are missing the really good ability to dodge and the extra distance on a dodge. I think you could certainly add dodge plus 1 inch onto the Knights of Justice, but I think you could probably add dodge plus 3 if you really wanted to as well, without really like making them particularly broken. And that lets them join Teutonic Knight links that are doing move dodges to get forward, and they keep up with the rest of the link then. Now, by comparison, if we look at the Knights of the Hospital, the profiles of the Knights of Justice kind of already fit into the Knights of the Hospital pretty well. But you could consider also adding, if we make any of the changes, right? I propose some changes to the Knights of the Hospital I think would be cool to see, and lean more into that Armored Knight vibe. You could make some similar, maybe not all of those changes, because those were some relatively large buffs overall to the Knights of the Hospital. You could make some of the same, right? To draw them into that theme. You could even do things like add maybe Terrain 0G to the Knights of Justice as well, just like that's a really small thing, but then it also shows that they draw a little bit like some thematic inspiration from the Knights of Santiago. Now, you don't have to go overboard there, but the basic idea is that the mechanically idealized role of a Knight of Justice is a piece that can join any of those other order teams and feel like it fits in and be really good and strong in those links. Now, the price point should match. That's totally fine, right? Whatever they need to cost for that to be reasonable is fine, but right, that's what they should be doing. A Knight of Justice is something that you should be able to, yep, you could have them leading a light infantry link team, that's totally fine, right? You have the one big knight and you have their light infantry support, totally down with that as a vibe. That's how, for example, the missile launcher is mostly currently used when it's taken, but they should also be able to join those knight links and not compromise the integrity of those links, to actually be part of them, because they are Knights of Justice of the military orders. Now, continuing on from there, in terms of the wildcards that can be added to links, we have the Womp Womp profile, the Military Order Knight Commander. This was an attempt by Corvus Belli, right? Credit to them. They identified two things when they did the military orders redesign. The first was that basically, back in N3, you took a Fusilier Lieutenant every single time. You had some Fusiliers, and they hid in the table corners, and one of them was your Lieutenant. And they wanted, right, military orders to have knights leading the military orders, not Angus, who has been seconded to the military orders as an attaché, leading the military orders. And they made changes that kind of forced that, and the Knight Commander was the compromise piece. The Knight Commander was Corvus Belli going, okay, look, we've taken away your Fusilier lieutenants. You have to take a knight as your lieutenant to lead the military orders, but we'll give you this profile that's built to. You don't want to take an active lieutenant. You shouldn't have to take that in every single game. Here's the Knight Commander. And the Knight Commander doesn't work because he's colossally expensive and just slots into a Crozier Link team, and the Crozier Link team is not particularly good. Now, how do we fix this? Bare freaking minimum, you allow the military order Knight Commander to belong to a military order, and so you just allow him to join any of the links, right? Allow him to join any link team and just count as a Knight Hospitaller or Knight Teuton or whatever when he joins that link team. So that he can actually, you can just put this, if you need to, you can just put this guy in a Knight of the Hospital link, you can put this guy in a Teuton link or something. Now, I still don't think he works particularly well because those price points for an ultimately passive model suck. Yes, there are a couple of NCOs in there are two NCOs and one of them is okay that you can put in military orders. Military orders shouldn't be the command and control faction, right? That's Invincible Armies territory. That's other factions territory. Impinging on that with military orders is really just kind of like bandwagoning onto a design idea. Get rid of that. Get rid of that +1 order lieutenant profile. Give him counterintelligence, maybe, or give him +1 command token or +2 command tokens. I don't care. But honestly, the entire concept needs a little bit of revisiting. We can band-aid over how this works to make it fit a little bit better, but having a cheap, lightly armored dude as your military orders commander, when no, actually just make it more possible, right? Make it more possible for military orders players to play heavy infantry lieutenants, and you solve the problem that way. We've seen O12 with Ment agents, right? 15 points for chain of command. Hot damn. Knight Commander, make it a really cheap, efficiently organized chain of command holomask profile, and just rename the damn things, right? You retired Father Knights, you change them into Knights of Justice, you can retire Knight Commanders and call them something else. Literally just change the name to Knight Captain or Knight Lieutenant, and there you go. You're done. You use the same model, right? It's fine. You haven't obsoleted anything, and you have enabled pieces like Hospital Lieutenants, Teuton Lieutenants, Deferson with a let's say 18-point wildcard, counts for any link team, and has chain of command. You're done. Sweet, cool. You could even do like chain of command +1 command token. I don't know why that wouldn't work mechanically, and it would do more things to make this interesting. But that's what is kind of necessary. I'm getting real pie in the sky here. I admit that. But for my money, the Knight Commander was ultimately a compromise piece, and it just doesn't work. Like, that compromise really can be abandoned with lean into the design goal that you wanted to pursue in the first place, but make it work. Now, there are probably more wildcards that can be talked about. In fact, there are a lot because the military orders fire teams are kind of just like an absolute soup. But we're gonna end that part because this is 57 minutes already. Hot damn! With the PanOceanian Blackfriars. I kind of like them. Maybe very slightly expensive, but these are the kind of pieces that can be added to. They're cool utility profiles. I don't mind them at all in Neoterra. I don't mind them at all in military orders. I think you could lightly optimize these profiles because 30 points is quite a lot for a single wound dude, but just a little bit. Just look, small optimization pass. Don't care what it is. Small optimization pass because the concept of these is cool. The models are sweet, and you have we can definitely do something with albedo in N5. By God, there can be something done with albedo in N5. But the broad idea of these as pieces, it can work very, very nicely. You could even do some slightly kookier and weirder things with these models, but just make them fit into link teams very slightly better, because obviously at the moment they do break composition bonuses. I don't know if they need to change to just count as Croziers, for example. I wouldn't necessarily say that, because that doesn't make a lot of thematic sense. But you can profile optimize either to make them work better as independent agents, which fits what I understand of their fluff quite well, or make them attractive enough that breaking composition bonuses is still something that's at least a little bit appealing. Just small changes. I don't really like. You could wishlist any number of changes to Blackfriars. I don't think they need a ton, but they are one of those pieces that's like, oh, that's kind of cool. Oh, it's 30 points. Okay, how do we just make this worth it so that at 10% of my army is not what I'm paying for a single wound dude? Now, from here, we get into more of the good stuff. It's the Tikbalang, the armored chasseur of a Continento. And this might be the best tag in the game. If it's not, it's really close. Like it's on a pedestal that reads best tags in the game, and that pedestal is occupied by a variety of different pieces for different reasons. If you have played against this, you do not need me to explain why it's outstanding. The baseline Tikbalang is incredible, and this one gets Religious Troop, which is, yes, a downgrade, and Armor Piercing on the HMG, which means that it is the best AP HMG in the entire sectoral by a colossal margin, because there is basically very, very little in the way of competition. The Tikbalang needs no changing. The Tikbalang is wonderful and perfect, and look, 68 points is not cheap, but you get everything that you pay for in this case. Frankly, in N4, most competition military orders compositions are carried to a greater or lesser extent by the Tikbalang. In a similar vein, another independent piece that does not need any changes really at all is the Montesa Order Motorized Knights. These guys are awesome. I've spoken about them in other videos. They're fantastic. They're aggressively costed and very, very good. We might see changes to them just because the introduction of vehicle rules is gagging for some interaction with the motorcycle rule. I would be astounded if motorcycles didn't get folded into vehicles. So who knows how that will result in changes to pieces like this, but at least as they are in N4, perfect, no notes, needs no changes, and another one of those pieces that military orders really leverage very, very heavily to scrape their way into competition spots in N4. Another good piece that really needs little in the way of changes are Trinitarian tertiaries, who, look, frankly, are just one of the best infiltrating specialist kind of pieces in the entire game, which is fascinating because they actually don't fit very well into military orders, because military orders tends to run slightly order light because they're so expensive, and a hidden deployment model that keeps its own order out of your order pool is really damn hard to use in military orders. It tends to materially weaken the broad game plan. That said, when you need them, and they're very, very good, and they are just very well statted and equipped skirmisher pieces. They have full mimetism -6, they've got ballistic skill 12, and a nice suite of weapons, including like just boarding shotguns and submachine guns. Submachine guns are not a piece I love on every kind of a model, but for 23 points for a ballistic skill 12 Mim 6 submachine gun that also has mines and is a forward observer, like, excellent. The mine layer profiles are good. They're starting to get more expensive because of those boarding shotguns, but they're good as well. And there's even going to be use for that multi-sniper occasionally, because how multi-snipers are discounted when put on infiltration profiles. I like them. I think they will open up as options considerably more if the rest of military orders lets them fit in just a little bit more easily. Now, there are a number of other pieces that I would like to mention. Mendoza, for example, we're not going to cover. He is awesome. When he goes off harder than like many other pieces in the game. He's just colossally expensive and fits therefore very difficult. It's very difficult to fit him into the broader list. But if his points cost comes down just like a tiny little bit, and the rest of the faction moves around him, you could put him in as a flex or vanity piece, etc. Sepulchre is very similar. Sepulchre is on the verge of greatness. It's just, it has the curse of tags that don't have AP HMGs, and PanOceania can't afford to have its heavy machine guns, particularly on profiles that expensive, struggle to put down enemy tags if the enemy tags are on ARO duty. I actually love the Seraph. I think the model is one of the best models that has ever been produced in Infinity, and I love the idea of tags with Oxbots. It's just that the Seraph needs a little bit of a tweak to either be attractive at the price point for the compromises that it makes, or make fewer compromises. And if I'm being perfectly blunt, there should be a Seraph with combat jump profile. I don't know how you would balance that. I don't know what it would be like, but they made the Cascuda work, so they can make a combat jump Seraph work, as in like combat drop. Just do that, you cowards. Do it. It'd be awesome. Like, make it terrible, but make it an actual profile. Someone out there will love it. The last piece to actually talk about in any kind of depth, and we are running over time here, is the Equestrian Order of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, aka we have the Montesa Tikbalang at home. Now, there is a point that Loki has made in his notes that I think is really important here, and that is that, as a PanOceanian player, having marker state big guns, even if it's as weak a marker state as the Holy Sepulchre having hollow projector, has utility. I am seeing PanOceanian players run things like Ulans in some lists, despite the fact that an Ulan is aggressively overcosted, because if you're playing PanOceania, you sometimes just can't afford to have your big gun compromised before it gets a chance to shoot. The Ulan is under a marker state, the Knight of the Holy Sepulchre is the same. It is very difficult, right? It requires guesswork to actually turn off and neutralize that APHMG NCO Holy Sepulchre Knight before it has a chance to shoot. Now, when it shoots, it's a ballistic skill 14 APHMG with potentially surprise attack, which is not the worst gun in the world, even at that 56-point price point. The durability is the closest thing that comes to the price point is expensive, but the durability is potentially what lets the Sepulchre Knights down, because they are just, at the end of the day, 2 wounds. They lose a face-to-face roll with a missile launcher, they could just die. On top of that, surprise attack is the least reliable positive modifier in the entire game, because it is not going to be useful against models with 6th sense, and often what you are going to be calling on your heavy guns to put down as a PanOceanian player is core-linked enemy arrows, which means that the Holy Knight does actually just not have the best face-to-face rolls. He doesn't have as good face-to-face rolls as you might hope against that kind of piece, and he's not tough enough to reliably survive if he loses a face-to-face roll with some random core-linked Fusilier missile launcher. Now, ultimately, there's only so much that you can ask from a 56-point piece. You bring support for this kind of model. You bring elements that help this kind of model work. You can afford something like a doctor or a paramedic to help back this guy up. And sometimes the Knight of the Holy Sepulchre is what you need, because you need a model under a marker state. Now, frankly, the entire Holo Projector setup, I think, could use some changes, because Holo Projector remains the jankiest rule in the entire game in terms of communicating its understanding to players. And on top of that, the Holy Sepulchre Knight is paying an awful lot for CC attack +1 damage, natural born warrior. Like ballistic skill attack +1 damage on the APHMG, I really like, but those close combat skills are costing it pretty dearly, and we don't want frenzy on a piece like this to offset the cost of that CC, but the cost of that CC is weighing the model down a lot. Now, you can bear that on some models. Part of the tragedy of military orders is that you can't bear it on everything, but over the course of this now quite lengthy video, I've talked about a number of ways that the faction might change that could alleviate some of that. Ultimately, as we circle back to, well, what do I think should be done with military orders, I think it's quite a lot, like there's space to give a lot of buffs to military orders, but I don't think any of them need to be huge. I think the profile optimization activity that we know Corvus Belli is going through is probably going to be enough to potentially breathe a fair bit of life into this faction. All they really need is a bit of that developer attention, a bit of that TLC applied to a sufficiently large number of profiles, and I think the faction kind of hangs together a lot better and works quite well without that need to aggressively focus and compromise just to get lists that are functional enough to go like 2-1 or 4-1 at an event. Now, we have already run over time. We're sitting at 1 hour and 6 minutes as I'm speaking, so I do have to wrap the video up there. But I have a sample list that Lockie has provided that I actually quite like the look of and I think is really cool, and includes a number of very cool pieces in it on screen now. You can always pause the video if you'd like to take a look, interrogate, and pick apart, but this is a really good kind of like brawling list that uses some cool pieces that military orders have access to. It might play well in a scenario like supplies, for example, or in any scenario where, good firepower is something that you want to carry yourself through the game. Now, as always, big thanks to everyone who supports these videos and makes videos like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link at the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the genesis of this particular topic was multiple requests that I have received from both supporters and channel members to either cover military orders or other factions, or give some thought about how the faction might change in N5. So thank you very much, people who made those requests to make videos like this possible, and also it's really nice to have the inspiration. As always, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.